Hi, this is Paul Neale from Pen Productions, and today we're going to have a look at how I create these scenes that I've been posting about. These are very simple to generate and a lot of fun to work with because it's all procedural. What you're looking at in this current scene are just a bunch of cylinders and boxes. A couple of extra bits in my little rope here, trying to make it look a Wile E. Coyote-esque. My good friend Lee Johnson mentioned to me that it needed an impossible cantilevered rock um, in the scene, so that's what I've generated here. And the way this scene has been created is with a whole lot of polygons and absolutely no modeling. So I haven't done any sculpting, haven't done anything with it. It hasn't left max at this point. It's just as it is. And again, it's all procedural. So let's look at how we generate some of this and make all this work. I'm just going to do a file reset. And we're going to start with a simple cylinder. And of course, I hit X to generate the menu that popped up there. So here's a cylinder. And I'm just going to go turn off those selection brackets because they drive me crazy. There we go. What we want to do is we want to reduce the poly count down a fair bit here. So we're going to go with 6 sides on this, and we're going to want some height cap segments probably. Essentially, we want to get these sides, the polys, fairly square. And in case we change the height and whatnot, we want to keep it that way. So let's right-click on our height and pick animation here. So we're going to go down to copy animation. And we're going to go down to height segments, and we're going to say paste wire. And in here now we're going to connect it. We're going to have the height control the height segments. And if we say connect, you'll see that the height now, as I change it, I'm getting lots and lots of height segments. So let's pick a value that gets us nice square ones. I'm guessing it's going to be probably somewhere around maybe divide by 10, maybe a bit more. Depends on what your scene's like. That's pretty good. So now as we change the height, you'll see new segments popping. And this is so as we change and work with the height of the these towers, these rock towers and stuff, it'll automatically subdivide itself up for us and keep it looking nice and clean. Same thing with the radius. So I'm going to go to the radius and the cap segments. And again, let's divide that by something and see what we get. We want to get a couple in there, so we should be able to. That's probably not too bad as we work with it. Maybe even a bit less. See if we can get that cap segment to stay there a bit longer. That looks pretty good. So that's going to update for us nicely. So to be able to do some shaping on this and work with some, get some sort of nice curves and everything that we had, I'm going to add a taper modifier so that we can taper it. And I'll just maybe taper it to start with, and maybe give it a bit of a curve to start with. And I usually add an X form because I don't like scaling objects generally. But you'll see why we want to use X forms down here below, and it's going to be because it's going to update better and it's going to produce new results. Instead of just scaling the end result, it's actually going to change the shape and form as we use the X form to, let's say, change the width of it. You'll see how it actually updates and works with it. So on top of this then, we're going to go with a displace modifier. And the first displace modifier is going to displace this mesh. Now there's not enough geometry displace here, so below the displace, we're going to add an open sub div. Now we're using open sub div instead of turbo smooth or mesh smooth because it's simply faster and it's a better solution these days. I'm going to set it as 4 to start with, and I'm going to turn off the ISO line display so we can see what's going on. You can see that you've got a lot of verts here. We're going to need that a lot higher eventually, but I'm probably going to work around 4 or 5 for the most part to keep this moving faster as I start playing around with the shapes. As it goes up and up, it's just going to be slower and slower for it to respond for us. Throw it into the clay mode for the fun of it. I'm going to open up the slate material editor here now. And in the slate material editor, we're going to start building something for our displace modifier to work with. So I'm going to start always with a composite, and I start with a composite so that I can layer some textures together if need be to be able to get the results that I'm after. In this case, I may not actually want to layer a whole lot together, but I'm going to start with a cellular, and I'm going to drop the composite output into the map slot of the displace. And let's crank that up a bit. You can see it's starting to do some crazy displacing here, and it's pushing everything up sideways. That's because of the direction of the displacement here with this planar map. I'm going to change it to cylindrical, and I want to get this to work in a cylindrical fashion, so it's working around it. Now, if I push up the shape, you can see what I'm starting to get here. I'm going to change it to chips, though, and I'm going to push the chips maybe size up, and then I'm going to take the tiling on the sides sort of down, so it tiles it around it and gets us some of this sort of shape. Now, one of the things you can do is maybe 0.15, have a slightly different in one than the other, and we can increase the more or less top to bottom this way, and we can start getting some shapes. Now, I'm going to increase the amount here and push that up. So we start creating some of those rock forms that are in there. And we can play with the sort of fall off between them. We could also play with the colors here and mess with those if we want. So you can see that you can push it in or push it out, however you want to do that. I want to swap those colors back, playing with some ideas here. And we can play with how many forms and shapes are kind of coming up in the rock and what kind of shapes are being created. I want to make those shapes a little harsher by clamping off the spread here and pushing the spread down. Now we could also start playing with fractal values and other values. We'll just start simple here. We can also then play with the angles, and that's something that really helps the shape get these rock forms kind of going on an angle. And I'm going to try that in 6 now, and you can see it's starting to create a nice shape. So just back down to 5 for speed and back down to our taper. And so now you can see that as we taper it, we get these new shapes. So this is why I've got these modifiers down below and not above, because it's updating. Same with the height. As the height grows, you'll see that it's trying to grow the shape. Now, it's actually passing through the displace here. So if we go into the sub-object, you'll see that the gizmo here, the cylindrical gizmo, isn't fitting the shape correctly. So let's do a little bit more connecting and connect some more so that's all working. So if we go down to the height, and I'm just going to say copy the height here and back to my displace, and we're going to go paste wire again. And so we can now connect those so that the two fit together. Now I'm going to go back and change the height. And you'll see that it's not doing probably quite what you would expect. And the reason it's not doing that is because the gizmo isn't sliding up and down. It's not staying in the right place. So we're going to have to do a little bit more wiring here on the gizmo. We're going to go and get the Z height, and we're going to put the height, I think it would be divisible by 2, and make it fit so it actually fits around the shape. Now as we change the height and we push the height up and down, it's automatically now making sure that the gizmo fits onto the object. So I don't have to bother fixing it every single time. I can just go ahead and build a scene once I've got my rocks. I don't have to worry about trying to update it and play with it. So we can curve that, and we can change its radius, and we can play around with some of the shapes and forms that we're getting here. Now back to our texture. We can maybe give ourselves some bigger chunks, some nice bigger rock forms, And again, in our first displace here, we can play with those values, push them in or out. And right now I'm pushing them out. We'll play around with what happens when they get pushed in the other way. When I flip these colors around, you'll see that might give us a better solution or a worse solution, depending on what we're after. So next, what we're going to want is a displace. So I like doing this with 2 and not trying to build it into 1, for the reason that I want this second one to use existing mapping instead of using this planar mapping. So same thing, I'm going to start with a composite map, and same thing, I'm going to start with a cellular, and we're going to put a cellular in here, and in this display, same thing, I'm going to go and drop in our output of our composite, and we're going to crank that up so that we start getting this bumpy mess going on. And then in our cellular, we're going to reverse the white and the black, say swap, and increase the size. And what you start getting is these nice chippy bits coming out of it and cutting into the surface nicely. So you can see that it's nice. Now I'm going to also say luminance center. Not always the best. You may have to play around with where the luminance center is to get it to work. And same thing, I'm going to try and stretch some of this out. So I'm going to make the height tiling sort of longer and stretch some of those out in this direction, which gives me some nice form. And again, keep them pretty big. They're big sort of angled chunks on it. And again, I can play around with how much it's displacing, how it's displacing that. And that's starting to look kind of cool. It's got a nice shape and form to it, starting to build some rocks going, these nice big sort of angles into it. So in our composite node, I'm going to add a new layer. I'm just going to copy my cellular down and plug that in. And of course, just like in Photoshop, this top layer is completely taking over the bottom layer. But that's fine. I want to see what its results are. So I want to set it back to 1 on the tiling. I want to bring these chips down smaller. And then back in the composite, I could go in and composite them in some way. So I could say addition if I wanted, and have them added into it. I could screen them together or overlay them together. Whatever starts getting me a good solution, multiply them into it if I wanted. And then we can play around with the amount that's happening. So we can work with some values here as to what looks good, what starts getting sort of a chipped out surface a bit more. So maybe something like that. Last one in here, we're going to add, believe it or not, a smoke. Noise is good, but smoke produces a really nice sort of rough kind of surface that's nice. I want to say swap as well. Maybe not. Let's see what happens with it. We don't want it that big. We want it sort of somewhere there. And again, we're going to want to mix that in either with a subtract or something, or an addition. Probably maybe a subtract here. I haven't used that one before. Let's see what it does. Might be making a bit of a mess. Might want to screen it in. And that's going to produce, just a bit of roughness on there. And if we flip that over, you can see that it produces a bit of a different solution. And again, we might want to go in and try different results when we do that to play around with those. Back down to our open sub div, and let's crank it up to a 6 again to see what we're really getting. And what you're now getting is these nice, sort of shapes and forms going on. One of the things I've been doing as well is trying to soften some of this out. You can see that we're getting some real nasty, messy areas here. After the first subdivision that cuts these lines in, I've been throwing in a relax and playing with it. Oops, I said a relax. That one, I think. There we go. And relaxing it out, just trying to fix some of the mess that it generates. And it kind of produces a little bit cleaner result when I do that to create the rocks. I'm not doing it above the top one, because if I did that, it's going to take all these nice cuts and edges out of things that I've generated. Now you can play with your luminance centers to where, because if you go too far one way, it'll start crushing back in on itself and not looking very good. Kind of find the sweet spot, and for the most part, you can get rid of all of those issues. So that's effectively what's happening in those scenes. Is I'm building these outcroppings. I'm just going to turn the open sub div back down to a 5 for now. Just so that things run a bit faster. And you'll see why we go and use an X form, for instance, is you can actually see that it's growing almost like the shape and form that's happening here is pretty much kind of growing on us. Now we might want to also increase the sides at this point so that it subdivides it cleaner and we get nicer sort of square polygons. And so you can create a lot of changes in the form just by playing around with the different modifiers on here. And back down, I'm going to take it back down to a 6. And the taper, and again, same thing, we could taper it in. And I'm going to go back down to the bottom here. Let's make one of those real tall towers. And you can see it just kind of grows itself as things happen. It's nice, you can limit effect. And you can play with the limit effect up and down if you want one of those long skinny towers I had. So the radius was quite high on the base, and then the taper was tapered a lot. Oops, wrong way. And you can see it all updating for me and just automatically creating there you go. There you have Tower of Rocks that's being produced completely organically for you. So let's just bump that back up to a 6. And then the final solution for the low res, I'd use this as the high res and probably project it down to a low res. But to generate that low res, really simple, just adding an optimize and letting it run. And you can reduce it a lot. Wrong spot in the stack. We went around there. That needs to be up at the top. And so now you can see that it's reduced it a lot. So this poly count right now is down to 177,000 verts. We could up and down it more if we wanted, as opposed to the original, which is at 528,000. So we could play with the optimize as well. Leaving it on while you're trying to work with it slows things down a lot as well. So there's the kind of end result. One other thing I've been playing around with this as well that's fun is the second taper. Again, I'm just going to go take the open subdiv down, and I want to put the taper above the X form. And let's try, I think, Y. And I'm going to take this taper limit effect off. That's kind of fun. That's actually a lot of fun seeing going that skinny. But the taper, the top taper, you can use now to sort of get a change in angle on the top and play with that. You could also go play with bend modifiers or anything else you're after to really have fun with it. The next one that I was doing was creating rocks around the base. And the rocks around the base are really simple. Again, exactly the same sort of thing. I'm just going to take a box. And we're going to, for the box, we're just going to make it 222 on the segments. And spherify modifier on it. And then we're going to drop into it an open sub div. And again, isoline off and just bump it up to a 5 for now. Splice modifier, we're going to set it to use existing. Open up our shader. I'm going to grab this entire shader here that I had. Just make a copy of it. And then we can play around with getting a nice looking rock happening. Say luminance center. And you can see that we can get a really nice looking rock shape really quickly. I'm going to say that 1-1. And let's also just turn off the visibility of these so we can see the shape we're getting with each one and how each one affects it. Probably want a bit more sides than that. Maybe something like that, looking nice and angular. And then we mix in our second one, keeping it just, subtle, keeping it low. And then we've got our smoke on the top. And we've got a rock. So to finish this scene off, I'm going to optimize this. And maybe set it to like again, I'd create a low-res version of this, so I've optimized that a fair bit so it's a little bit faster. And then I'm going to go into our ribbon object paint. We are going to paint with objects in a list, and I'm going to add selected in there. We could add a bunch of them if we wanted. Maybe a little bit of offset. We'll see how big this is. We'll check the other settings. Paint on scene, and we have way too many going here, so I'm just going to delete those and crank my spacing way up. Depends on your scene size. And then the rotate is going to be random, 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 and random. Probably somewhere around, I don't know, let's say about 30 to 120. And that's starting to look kind of good. So maybe a bit more spacing. And now I was finishing it off by just planting in some rocks. I should have centered the pivot as well. So let's just center the pivot on this so that it's in the right spot. Play with our offset, and then just we can just make a scene now. What's cool about this is it'll actually, you can pile rocks on top of rocks if you go and turn on paint on selected. So as we paint here, it'll start to build rocks up on top of rocks. You got to be careful because you'll get some starting to float if your offsets. Looks like my offset's way too high. Spacing might be, you may have to delete some, or again, not paint as much of a change in size to start with so that they don't look like they're floating, whatever it might be to get them to work. So right now you're getting these crazy sort of values happening here. Find the right ones and then start painting. And again, it's neat because you can get these building up. I would also collapse this object or make a copy of it to collapse for this, because this is going to get slow because this is doing the displacements and optimizing as you're painting. So it kind of slows things down. So everybody should have some fun making some really cool Wile E. Coyote scenes now. Enjoy.